It began with a photograph, a grainy satellite image leaked from intelligence channels, showing something no one expected to see. On the Russian Far East coast, under a veil of fog and snow, Chinese destroyers sat anchored beside Russian submarines. Overhead, long-winged bombers rolled across the same runway as stealth fighters painted with red stars. The picture spread across classified networks in Washington, London, and Brussels, igniting the same question everywhere. Had Moscow and Beijing crossed a line the West thought they would never cross? The drills had been publicized as routine, yet the scale told a different story. Two 95 bombers, relics of the Cold War, thundered over the Pacific with escorts. Not Russian fighters, but Chinese J-20s flying in perfect formation. On the surface, Russian and Chinese warships sailed side by side, exchanging signals through a shared data link that NATO analysts had never seen before. Amphibious landing craft practiced beach assaults, while satellites overhead captured hundreds of armored vehicles offloaded in synchronized waves. It was not symbolic, it was not a gesture, it was the rehearsal of a joint war plan. In Brussels, NATO officers watched live feeds in stunned silence. For years, the alliance had counted on the differences between Moscow and Beijing. Competition, mistrust, divergent interests. Yet here they were, maneuvering as if guided by a single hand. Analysts scribbled notes, trying to explain how two militaries with different doctrines were moving like one. The answer was obvious and terrifying. They had been preparing for this far longer than anyone realized. In Moscow, the rhetoric was sharp. State television declared the drills a message to the West. Russia and China stood together against foreign aggression. In Beijing, officials downplayed the scale, calling it mutual training. But the images of Chinese admirals shaking hands with Russian generals told a different story. These were not rivals testing one another, they were partners, and perhaps more. The message rippled beyond governments. Across Asia, ordinary people watched clips on their phones. Russian tanks rolling across frozen ground with Chinese troops alongside them, naval gunfire echoing across the Sea of Japan. In Washington, lawmakers demanded urgent answers. What promises had been made behind closed doors? Was this an alliance in everything but name? And before we go deeper into this story, it's worth pausing for a moment. Where are you watching from? Europe, Asia, the US? Because this pact doesn't just affect one region, it touches the entire world. Drop your country in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed, because the story of this new alliance is only beginning. The drills ended with silence. Ships returned to ports, jets landed, tanks rolled back into depots. But the images remained burned into memory. Two powers once divided, now drilling as one. And for every Western planner, the fear was the same. This was not just exercise. It was a warning of what would come if Moscow and Beijing decided to stand together in war. What the satellites captured was only the surface. Behind the parades of ships and the thunder of bombers lay something far more unsettling. A pact, hidden in shadows, stitched together away from cameras and press conferences. Western intelligence sources began to piece it together from fragments. Encrypted cables between Moscow and Beijing, sudden visits of senior defense officials that were never announced, cargo flights landing in the middle of the night at remote airfields. At first, it seemed improbable. Russia and China had been rivals for centuries, bound more by caution than trust. But the evidence kept growing. Leaked documents suggested that the two governments had quietly agreed to share far more than fuel and supplies. Data networks were being linked. Early warning systems for missiles were being synchronized. Naval command protocols, once zealously guarded, were now written in dual languages. It was not just cooperation, it was integration. For Russia, battered by sanctions and war, the benefits were obvious. Chinese electronics filled the gaps in its defense industry. Funding flowed through shadow banking networks, allowing Moscow to keep its military machine alive. And perhaps, most importantly, Russia gained an ally willing to stand shoulder to shoulder against the West. For China, the Pact was a golden prize. Access to Russian energy at discounted prices guaranteed fuel for its warships and aircraft. Joint exercises in the Arctic opened pathways to the north that Beijing had long dreamed of exploiting. And deep inside the Pact's classified annexes, intelligence analysts believed, lay something darker: arrangements for nuclear coordination, an understanding that if one power faced NATO or the United States, the other would not stand aside. In Brussels, NATO planners began to call it by a new name: the Shadow NATO of the East. Not a formal treaty, not something signed for the cameras, but a working alliance bound by necessity and secrecy. The words unsettled even the most seasoned diplomats. The West was no longer dealing with isolated challenges in Europe or Asia. It was facing a coordinated front stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. And here the question becomes unavoidable. Is this merely tactical cooperation, a marriage of convenience that will collapse under pressure? Or is it the foundation of a true alliance, one meant to challenge the West in every theater? What do you think? In Washington, the implications rattled the Pentagon. War games that had once simulated a war with China or a war with Russia now had to plan for both, at the same time, working in concert. Suddenly, the numbers looked different. Two great powers, their militaries overlapping, their economies feeding one another, would stretch American and NATO forces thin across two continents. In Moscow and Beijing, the tone was triumphant. Leaders spoke in vague but menacing terms about multipolarity and a new order. But behind the slogans, soldiers and sailors were learning to fight side by side. The photographs of joint tank crews smiling under shared flags were more than propaganda. They were a sign that the line dividing East and West was being redrawn, and the buffer of mistrust between Russia and China was dissolving faster than anyone in the West had imagined. The Pact remained unacknowledged, invisible to the world's headlines. But every exercise, every convoy, every handshake in the frozen ports of Vladivostok or the shipyards of Shanghai whispered the same truth. A new alliance was forming in the shadows, and the longer it stayed hidden, the stronger it grew. The revelations of the Pact hit Western capitals like a thunderclap. In Brussels, generals gathered around screens displaying satellite feeds of Russian and Chinese fleets drilling side by side. The silence in the room was broken only by the scratch of pens and the low hum of projectors. No one needed to say it out loud. The alliance NATO had long feared was no longer hypothetical. It was materializing before their eyes. In Washington, urgency spread through the Pentagon's war rooms. War games were rewritten overnight. Planners who had spent years modeling a confrontation with Russia in Europe or China in the Pacific now stared at scenarios where both moved in tandem. The maps showed two simultaneous crises, one over the Baltic states, another over Taiwan. The numbers told a brutal truth. Even the world's strongest military could not fight both wars at once without risking collapse. Orders were dispatched within hours. U.S. carrier strike groups surged into the Pacific. Air squadrons shifted from Germany to Poland, from Guam to Japan. Long-forgotten bases in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands suddenly roared with life as hangars opened and bombers taxied onto frozen runways. The message was clear. The West was preparing for the possibility that the next great war would not be fought against one adversary, but two. The ripples spread across Asia. In Tokyo, alarms rang in the Diet as reports confirmed Chinese destroyers had been spotted sailing alongside Russian vessels through the Sea of Japan. Japanese F-35s shadowed the formation, their pilots silent, watching as the two navies moved with synchronized precision. For Japan, the nightmare was obvious. If China and Russia moved together, the defense of its islands would become a desperate fight against overwhelming numbers. In Seoul, the reaction was equally grim. South Korean analysts warned that a Sino-Russian bloc would embolden North Korea, turning every crisis on the peninsula into a potential flashpoint backed by two nuclear giants. Defense officials urged faster deployment of American missile defenses, even as protesters filled streets demanding restraint. The peninsula, already a powder keg, now sat under a greater shadow. In Australia, the response was panic mixed with resolve. The government accelerated its defense budget, calling for urgent deployment of U.S. bombers to northern bases. The long-discussed nuclear submarine program suddenly felt less like a future plan and more like a survival requirement. Ministers spoke bluntly. If Moscow and Beijing were building a new axis, the Pacific needed to be armed to the teeth. Even in Europe, where the war in Ukraine had already stretched nerves to breaking, the sense of dread grew. Polish commanders warned that Russian forces training with Chinese observers could mean new tactics for future battles in Eastern Europe. In the Baltic states, governments declared states of readiness, their small militaries bracing for the possibility that they might be the first to feel the impact of a pact that spanned continents. And here, another question emerges. Should NATO prepare to confront both adversaries at once, risking global escalation, or focus on one theater and hope deterrence holds in the other? What would you do? Markets trembled as the news spread. Oil prices spiked, shipping routes shifted, and investors whispered of a new Cold War. But this time, colder, darker, and far less stable. The alignment of two great powers had already begun to shift the balance, and the West was scrambling to keep up. Yet, in Moscow and Beijing, the mood was celebratory. Their leaders spoke of new horizons. Their generals smiled as troops drilled together under shared banners. To them, it was not just an exercise, it was the dawn of a partnership that could outlast sanctions, outpace isolation, and outmaneuver the West. The world was watching two giants move closer, step by step, until their shadows merged into one. And in Washington, Brussels, Tokyo, and Canberra, the same thought haunted every briefing. If this pact was real, the West might be facing the most dangerous alignment of forces since 1945. The breaking point came not with an official declaration, but with a maneuver gone too far. In the icy waters of the Bering Strait, a narrow channel between Russia and Alaska, a joint Chinese-Russian naval group cut northward under the cover of fog. 12 ships in total, destroyers, frigates, and support vessels moved in tight formation, their radars locked forward, their guns uncovered. American satellites tracked the convoy instantly. Within hours, U.S. destroyers shadowed the group, steaming parallel at a distance measured not in miles, but in minutes of missile flight. On the decks, sailors stood tense, binoculars raised, every turret swiveling slowly as if to remind the other side that they were not invisible. Above them, the tension grew worse. Russian Tu-95 bombers, escorted by Chinese J-20 fighters, pushed dangerously close to Alaska's air defense zone. American F-22 Raptors scrambled from Elmendorf Air Force Base, intercepting the formation head-on. The skies filled with the silent theater of power, missiles armed, radars hot, pilots watching each other from canopies a few hundred meters apart. One wrong twitch of the joystick, one accidental lock-on, and the standoff would explode into fire. For 30 minutes, the two groups moved like predators, circling the same prey. American commanders demanded answers from Moscow and Beijing, but none came. Instead, the warships pressed forward, passing within 20 nautical miles of U.S. territory before finally veering eastward. The message had been sent. The Pacific, once an American lake, was now contested ground. In Europe, a similar drama played out. NATO radar picked up Russian bombers accompanied by Chinese electronic warfare aircraft flying over the Baltic. Typhoon fighters from Britain and Gripens from Sweden rose to meet them, escorting the formation out of Allied airspace. The encounter was brief, but its symbolism echoed far louder than its duration. For the first time in modern history, Chinese aircraft were flying combat drills over Europe, side by side with Russian wings. Inside NATO's headquarters, the incident sent shockwaves. Generals spoke in hushed tones about the possibility that the alliance would soon face simultaneous crises on opposite ends of the globe. Politicians debated openly whether Article 5, the cornerstone of NATO's defense, could withstand a coordinated assault by two nuclear powers acting in unison. Markets collapsed again. Airlines rerouted trans-Pacific flights to avoid the Bering Strait. Shipping companies hesitated to sail through the Arctic routes, now patrolled by Russian and Chinese icebreakers. The world economy, already fragile, now buckled under the weight of fear. In Washington, the president was briefed in the Situation Room. Advisors pressed two options: confront the alliance directly with shows of overwhelming force, or hold back and avoid triggering a war the world was not ready to fight. Neither choice felt like strategy. Both felt like gambling with history. And so the question hung heavier than ever. Should the West push back against this rising pact, risking escalation into global war? Or should it step back and concede space, hoping to avoid catastrophe? What would you choose? The Chinese and Russian fleets disappeared back into the fog, their bombers returning to bases, their destroyers fading beyond the horizon. But the impression remained carved into the minds of every commander who witnessed it. This was no accident. It was a demonstration. Two powers, once separated by rivalry, now moved like a single giant, testing the limits of Western resolve. The world had just watched a rehearsal for confrontation, and everyone knew that next time, it might not end with a silent retreat into the fog. The joint exercises ended, the ships returned to port, the bombers landed on their runways, but the silence that followed was more dangerous than the drills themselves. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the West had watched two great powers move in concert, their militaries overlapping, their ambitions aligned. No treaty was signed, no public announcement made. And yet, the pact was already visible in the skies, on the seas, and across the frozen borders of Europe and Asia. Where once suspicion and rivalry had kept Moscow and Beijing apart, necessity had drawn them together. Each had what the other lacked, and together, they were stronger than the world was prepared to admit. In Washington, in Brussels, in Tokyo, and in Canberra, the fear was the same. What happens when this shadow pact steps fully into the light? What happens when joint exercises turn into joint operations in Ukraine, in Taiwan, or in the Arctic? The answers were uncertain, but the consequences were clear. A world that once moved to the rhythm of a single dominant power was now being pulled in two directions. And now the question remains, is this alliance a temporary convenience born of crisis, or the beginning of a new order where East and West face each other as rivals across every border, every sea, every sky? What do you think? The images of warships sailing side by side, of bombers escorted by fighters under two flags, will not fade. They are warnings carved into the future. And as the world waits for the next move, one truth cannot be ignored. The secret pact has already been made, and history is already changing. So, if you want to follow these flashpoints as they unfold, the drills, the alliances, the sparks that could ignite tomorrow's wars, make sure you are subscribed. Because the next revelation may not be a secret at all, but the opening move of a conflict that reshapes the century.